Let's talk tonight about a worldwide vision. We're going to look at this first session primarily at the period of time from 1950s up through the mid 60s or late 60s, and so let's dive in. We'll talk about a worldwide, a global. The Church of God Mountain Assembly goes global. And we're going to start by looking at beyond the Church of God Mountain Assembly and talk about the CGMA and its interdenominational fellowship. And in order to lay a framework for the rest of the session, I just want to start again by highlighting the leadership during this particular time. Now, Clayton Lawson, I mentioned in one of the earlier sessions, was born July 14th, 1910 in Knoxville. He was saved in Cincinnati under the ministry of H.D. Williams, ordained in 1936. He pastored churches in Sydney, Ohio, Cincinnati, Ohio, and Covington, Kentucky. He's the only man to serve in all four of the executive offices of the Church of God Mountain Assembly, serving as general overseer for 14 years, as assistant overseer for 3, general secretary and treasurer for 2 years, and served as assistant clerk also for 2 years. He was a national evangelist for 2 years, and he served as a member of the Board of 12 Elders for 43 years. He's one of the 4 men who preached in all 3 tabernacles and preached at the General Assembly at least 29 times. And so, Clayton Lawson is certainly important in that regard. Let's also mention Ira Hansford Moses was born May the 20th, 1905 in Whitley County, Kentucky. He's the son of William Moses and Jaylee Parks Moses. He's the grandson of John Parks. Was saved January the 10th, 1931 in a revival that John Parks and Kim Moses held at the Tabernacle in Jellicoe. His wife Esther was saved 2 days later, and so the two of them began a life together in Christian service. Ira Moses was ordained in 1943, was elected as pastor of the Kenford, Kentucky church shortly after that. 4 years later, he served as the pastor of the Stanfield, Kentucky church. And in 1947, the Moses family moved to Monroe, Michigan, and there he served as pastor of the Church of Monroe for 13 years. He came back in 1960, came back to Jellicoe and served as general overseer, and after his tenure of office as general overseer, he pastored the church in Williamsburg, Kentucky, and he was pastoring there when he died on March 29, 1979. He's in addition to serving 12 years as general overseer, he also served 3 years as assistant overseer, 6 years as assistant clerk, assistant secretary and treasurer, was on the board of elders for 31 years, and 26 times he preached at the General Assembly. In 1965, the second tabernacle that was built in Jellicoe had been outgrown, and the executive board and trustees pressed toward building a new tabernacle to accommodate the annual convention. They purchased adjoining property and from the Jellicoe school system and built an open-air tabernacle there that they later renamed partially in his honor and partially in honor of Claiborne Boyd Ellis Jr. C.B. Ellis was born in Bell County on December the 31st, 1925 to Reverend Claiborne Ellis Sr. and Louise Salem. C.B. was the son of, C.B. began preaching in his early 20s, preached his first sermon in Middlesboro, Kentucky, pastored 6 churches, and also evangelized a number of years before he was elected to the office of Assistant General Overseer. He was instrumental in the founding of the Church of God Mountain Assembly churches in Jamaica, and he was also had a hand in purchasing the campgrounds in Highland County, Ohio. He was elected to the Board of Elders in 1960, served for 14 years as an elder, and then elected again in 1980 to another tenure on the Board of Elders. Served as General Overseer from 1972 to 1976. So these are the leaders, the General Overseers of the Church of God Mountain Assembly during the period of time that we're going to talk about in tonight's session. Let's talk about fellowshipping denominations, some groups that we fellowship with. We've already mentioned the Church of God in Cleveland, Tennessee, and its influence, its role in CGMA history. You know, A.J. Tomlinson and others from the Church of God attended the General Assembly in 1911 and 1912. The CGMA sent messengers to Cleveland in 1912 and again in 1914. Exchange of ministers took place throughout the denominational history. Sometimes some of our men went into the Church of God. Sometimes Church of God ministers have come in to our fellowship. In 1955, H.D. Williams, the General Secretary of the Church of God, visited our General Assembly. In 1950, also the same year, 1955, J.A. Cross, the General Overseer of the Church of God, preached one night of our assembly. In 1988, Dr. Ray H. Hughes, who was a former General Overseer of the Church of God, preached at our General Assembly. And in 1993, John D. Nichols, the second Assistant Overseer of the Church of God, preached on Wednesday morning at the invitation of our General Overseer. And so there's been fellowship between the two groups since the beginning and continues even until present day. It's not unusual for us to have visiting pastors at the General Assembly or visiting officials at our General Assembly from the Church of God, and for someone from our organization to also represent us at the Church of God's General Assembly. I mentioned very briefly the Assemblies of God. In 1927, J.E. Spence of Tampa, Florida, sent a letter asking to consider a merger with the Assemblies of God. Don't know, nothing ever came of that. Really don't know any more about that except for what's recorded in the minutes from that year. In 1970s, G. Raymond Carlson, the overseer, general superintendent of the Assemblies of God, was in attendance at our General Assembly. And so we fellowship also with the Assemblies of God. One of the groups that we've fellowshiped perhaps the most with and the most closely with through the years is the Pentecostal Church of Christ, the International Pentecostal Church of Christ. The International Pentecostal Church of Christ was formed in 1976 as the result of a merger between the International Pentecostal Assemblies and the Pentecostal Church of Christ. The Pentecostal Church of Christ was a group that we had been fellowshipping with since the 1950s. At the 1950 General Assembly in Cincinnati, Ohio, Bishop Cyrus and Bishop Nichols attended as well as preached at the General Assembly in Cincinnati that year. We were also visited that year from the Pentecostal Church of Christ by Chester Miller, who was a missionary to Brazil. That's going to be important. We'll talk about Chester Miller a little bit later on. In 1960, while Chester Miller was the General Overseer of the Pentecostal Church of Christ, he and G.K. Nickel attended our General Assembly and also preached. Clayton Lawson went on a mission trip in the 1960s to Brazil to see in the 1950s with Chester Miller and saw their mission work there in Brazil. In 1985, the General Overseer of the IPCC, Tom Grinder, was a guest minister at our General Assembly. And in 1987, Dr. Clyde Hughes, the General Overseer of the International Pentecostal Church of Christ, came and visited our General Assembly. There was some talk in the early 80s, in the mid-80s, there was some talk about a merger between the Church of God Mountain Assembly and the International Pentecostal Church of Christ. And while that merger never took place, the fellowship continued. We have worked together through the years with a joint Sunday school convention that I'll talk about in the second session a little bit more, and also a joint leadership conference along with the International Pentecostal Church of Christ, the Pentecostal Free Will Baptist, and the Congregational Holiness Church. Every year in the fall, we have a joint meeting. And so these are some of the groups that we have fellowship with, the interdenominational fellowship through the years. While Jerome Walden was the general overseer in the early 70s, we had visits from Larry Cagle of the original Church of God, Reverend Gilstrap of the Congregational Holiness Church, G. Raymond Carlson that I mentioned earlier from the Assemblies of God, Chester Miller from Pentecostal Church of Christ, James Loudermilk of the Church of God, the original North Assembly, Ben Rose of the International Pentecostal Holiness Church, B.J. White of the Church of God of Prophecy, Glenn Burris of the International Church of the Foursquare Gospel, and many other independent pastors of other denominations, other organizations throughout that time. And in 1993, I thought this was in my notes and I don't see it, but 1994, it is in my notes, the General Overseer of the International Pentecostal Holiness Church, Bishop B.E. Underwood, who was also at the same time the chairman of the Pentecostal World Conference, was at our General Assembly at the invitation of our General Overseer and preached that morning. So we had one of the most important men, if you will, one of the most significant individuals in the Pentecostal movement was at our General Assembly and preached in 1994. So we began fellowshipping with other organizations of like precious faith from almost the beginning, and that has continued. I want to talk about the Pentecostal Fellowship of North America, but before I do, I want to mention the Pentecostal World Fellowship, or the Pentecostal World Conference, as it's sometimes called. It was founded in 1947 in Zurich, Switzerland, by Swiss pastor Leonard Steiner and also David Duplessis. You might remember that name from session number 2. David Duplessis was a Pentecostal who was especially interested in ecumenical work. He was involved with the World Council of Churches and really helped to elevate Pentecostals to the status of many of the other mainline denominations. And so together they founded a conference, a convention that would take place, and it meets generally every 3 years. Sometimes it's been 2, sometimes it's been 4, but it meets generally every 3 years at a major city around the world, bringing Pentecostal churches and Pentecostal organizations together around the globe to get together to talk about the Pentecostal movement and to gather together for worship and fellowship. Most recently in 2016, the Pentecostal World Fellowship was in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And so, it's a big event, and we've, the Church of God Mountain Assembly has had our leadership at different times has attended the meeting in different places around the globe. Coming out of this global Pentecostal convention, the Pentecostal Fellowship of North America was founded in 1948 by representatives from the Assemblies of God, the Church of God, the International Church of the Foursquare Gospel, the International Pentecostal Holiness Church, the Open Bible Standard, and other churches as well, meeting in 1948 to meet together in an annual convention, to have church services together, to organize, to work together in cooperative projects, and to fellowship among other denominations. Luther Gibson in 1949 attended the PFNA meeting as a voting delegate, and so real early on, the Church of God Mountain Assembly got involved with other Pentecostal groups on an organized level. And so after that, the Mountain Assembly was not at the first meeting, but we were at the second meeting. Our General Overseer Luther Gibson. And then in the 1950s, our General Overseer Clayton Lawson got more and more involved. In 1952, the Assembly voted to give Clayton $250 to help him with his trip to London for the Pentecostal World Conference there. And 3 years later, the Assembly gave him $500 to help him with his trip to Stockholm for the the World Pentecostal Conference. In 1957, Clayton was selected to speak at the PFNA meeting in Seattle, Washington. In 1952, Luther Gibson had preached the PFNA meeting at Angelus Temple in Los Angeles. And in 1959, he preached the PFNA meeting when it was back in Des Moines. In the 1950s, Clayton served on the executive board or the executive committee as general overseer of the PFNA. And in 1960, Ira Moses took his place when he was elected general overseer. And before his tenure was up, he had served a term as the secretary and treasurer of the PFNA. 1965, Jerome Walden preached the PFNA meeting in Dayton, Ohio. And so you can see that the Church of God Mountain Assembly was involved almost from the very beginning and has continued to stay involved with the PFNA. Now the PFNA officially went out of business in 1994, had a transition. It changed in 1994 with the Miracle of Memphis. Sometimes you'll see if you Google Miracle of Memphis or the Memphis Miracle, this is what they're talking about, was the convention that took place in 1994 in Memphis, Tennessee. In 1948, the invitation was sent out to various Pentecostal groups to come together and form the Pentecostal Fellowship of North America. Every group that was invited was exclusively a white Pentecostal denomination. And so so in 1994, the move to end the decades of racial separation was launched in Memphis to bring together black Pentecostals and white Pentecostals in one group. Now, when we talked about Azusa Street and the birth of the modern Pentecostal movement, we recall the fact that William Seymour was an African American and launched the Azusa Street Revival. And the Azusa Street Revival was miraculous in that it was multiracial, multi-ethnic. That there were Hispanics and there were blacks and there were whites, people coming from all over the place. And in the 1920s, many of the Pentecostal groups began to segregate in racial lines. And if you remember, we talked about the Church of God in Christ forming, C.H. Mason coming out from the Assemblies of God and forming what was almost an exclusively black Pentecostal denomination. And so for years, black and white Pentecostals fellowship separately. And in 1994, the PFNA meeting extended an invitation, the PFNA General Board extended an invitation to many leaders from the black Pentecostal denominations, as well as many charismatic groups that had been formed in the 60s and 70s, and to bring them together and in an attempt to unify Pentecostals and charismatics together in fellowship. And so Cecil Johnson had just been elected general overseer that year at our convention. Lonnie Light was his assistant, and so Brother Cecil was on the PFNA board as a voting member of the council and attended the first PCCNA meeting on behalf of our organization there in Memphis. And so the Church of God Mountain Assembly is still a member of the member denomination of the Pentecostal Charismatic Churches of North America. Let's talk about other ways in which the Church of God Mountain Assembly called a worldwide vision. We're talking about the interdenominational fellowship that existed, and so let's talk about the birth of the public relations department. And the Public Relations Director was an office that was created in the General Assembly in 1969. Now, let me provide just a little bit of background. And I've not got the chance to talk about the Gospel Herald yet, but hopefully we'll talk about that in the first session next week and talk about the history of our magazine a little bit. But as a precursor to that discussion, in 1967, after 25 years of having the Gospel Herald, and the Gospel Herald being published by the General Secretary and Treasurer, the Church of God Mountain Assembly recognized that that's a big task, especially as the Assembly finances begin to grow and the Assembly, the number of churches multiplied, and we were beginning to launch out into a foreign mission work. The Church of God Mountain Assembly recognized this is a big task for one man to handle the finances of the Assembly and also try to, on a monthly basis, keep up with publishing a magazine on a regular basis. And so in 1967, the Assistant General Secretary and Treasurer, who up to that time had very little duties other than to assist the General Secretary and Treasurer during the week of the convention and maybe a few other times during the year to help him with some projects if he was geographically close enough to be of any assistance. But the Assistant General Secretary and Treasurer, for the first time, had some job duties added to his workload, some significant duties. And they took the job of the editor of the Gospel Herald and they assigned it to the Assistant General Secretary and Treasurer. Wade Hughes was the first Assistant General Secretary and Treasurer to assume that duty. And so he did edit the next 10 or so issues of the Gospel Herald. But before the General Assembly in 1968, Wade Hughes left the Church of God Mountain Assembly and joined the Church of God in Cleveland. And so in 1968, when the General Assembly convened, the Assistant General Secretary and Treasurer's job was wide open, and the job for the Gospel Herald was wide open. And so that year in 1968, Charles Davis, pastor of the church in Whitfield, Virginia, came to the assembly that year intending to run for Gospel Herald editor. He had just purchased a printing press, and he determined that it would be in the best interest of the assembly if we could print our magazine in-house, and it would help to undercut some of the costs that were associated with the printing. And so he did run for Gospel Herald editor, but he didn't get elected. And so undeterred by the loss, he came to the assembly the following year with a resolution to create the office of Public Relations Director. And so if you don't get one job, create a job, right? And so in 1969, the General Assembly passed a resolution saying we shall have a Public Relations Director who shall be elected by the General Council for a period of 2 years. His duties shall be to to promote the assembly and its local churches through all means possible. He shall maintain a file of photographs of the churches and ministers and other information of each church and minister, and shall furnish this information and photographs at their request. By virtue of his office, he shall serve as chairman of the publicity committee. He shall serve on a non-paying basis, but shall be allowed his actual expenses from the tithe fund. And so Charles Davis submitted the resolution to create the position, and when the election was held, he was elected as the first man to serve in that capacity. Again, the purpose of the Public Relations Director was to promote the Church of God Mountain Assembly, its churches and its ministers, to promote it through any means possible. He's in charge of publicity for the assembly to get the word out. The task is to make the Church of God Mountain Assembly, again, a worldwide movement, to get the word out. People know about the Church of God Mountain Assembly. In 1970, Jerome Walden was elected to serve as Public Relations Director. Jerome was pastoring the church in Cleveland, Ohio, and he served in that capacity for 4 years. In 1974, Bobby Wilson, the pastor of the Jellicoe Church, was elected to serve in this capacity. During this time, the General Assembly began to broadcast its services on the local radio station, on WJJT. and so begin to promote the assembly and get the word out there. In 1978, Leon Petrie was elected as the public relations director. Brother Petrie was pastoring the church in Cincinnati, Ohio, and he served in that capacity for 4 years. In 1982, James Earl Pruitt served as public relations director. Two things happened during Brother Pruitt's tenure. Number one, let me back up. Not Brother Pruitt. In 1981, the public relations director and the mission director got together, and they said the radio's not good enough. Let's start promoting the assembly on television. And so in 1981, the mission night service was filmed and then broadcast on local television. And so for the next several years, the mission service to promote our mission work, to promote the worldwide vision of the Church of God Mountain Assembly was broadcast on local television. In the mid-'80s, somewhere about '86 maybe, we started recording all of the services and recording and broadcasting all of the services on the evening services on television. In 1983, while James Earl Pruitt was the public relations director, the public relations director adopted the assignment, adopted the job of preparing the delegates' package for the General Assembly. Now, early on, from the very beginning, each official elected by the General Assembly was required to give a report for their work done for the previous year. That's been in place for decades. And until 1967, that report was always an oral report. He would get up and give his report, talk about the things that he'd done. He might have had something in front of him where he would read it, but he would give a report before the delegation. In 1967, the Assembly voted to require each of the general officials to prepare a written report in mimeograph form and to furnish each delegate with a copy at the beginning of the General Assembly. And so when the delegate or when the general officials would get up to give their report, they would have a printed copy and would pass it out, distributed among the delegates, so that they could read it for themselves. In 1983, Brother Pruitt, as the public relations director, began gathering together those reports prior to the General Assembly, printing them together, and then publishing them in a booklet. So those that go to the assembly now that take for granted when you get the packet that all the reports are going to be in there bound together nicely and neatly and with a table of contents, and you can find everything by page numbers. Have Brother Pruitt as the public relations director, along with the rest of the executive board, to thank for that convenience. In sometime around 1970, almost early on, the public relations director began being responsible for recognizing visiting ministers and also representing the assembly at other places. I'll say more about that in just a minute. In 1984, James L. Cox Jr. was elected to the office of Public Relations Director. He served in that capacity for 2 years. In 1986, Leon Petrie was elected to another tenure. He served in that capacity for the next 20 years as Public Relations Director. In 2006, David Cornelius, pastor of the church in Kokomo, Indiana, was elected and served in that capacity for 8 years until 2014, when Scott Isham, our pastor in Temperance, Michigan, was elected and continues to serve in that capacity. Through the years, the job of the Public Relations Director has changed, has been modified from originally. I mentioned just a moment ago, almost immediately, almost early on, the Public Relations Director was responsible for recognizing guest ministers and responsible for representing the Church of God Mountain Assembly in other places. Now, granted, if the general overseer is able to go to somewhere, then he generally can go and represent the assembly for himself. Sometimes what happens is with the denominations and the Pentecostal groups, sometimes their conventions are taking place at the same time. It's impossible for the general overseer, for example, to be in one part of the country for for a convention of the Assemblies of God, perhaps, and also be somewhere else representing us at the convention of the Church of God. And so the public relations director oftentimes would go on behalf of the Church of God Mountain Assembly, representing the assembly in that capacity. One of the things that we know about everyone who has had the office, and it's not a requirement, but it's but it should be, right? Is everyone who has served the Church of God Mountain Assembly as public relations director has represented the assembly well in appearance. Men of prestige, men that represent us well, that look nice. Men who are not afraid to speak in public, men who are eloquent of speech, know how to address a congregation, know how to address a crowd, men that have really represented the organization. When you send somebody to represent you, you want somebody to represent you very well. And I think the Church of God Mountain Assembly has done a good job of choosing men to do exactly that. As the years have progressed, and certainly the way technology is today, the job of the public relations director, the promotion of the assembly has grown to the place where the public relations department is assuming the duty of promoting the assembly in social media and on the internet, and so this is another aspect that you talk from the days of the printing press. I bought a printing press. I can print some stuff to promote us. To the days of the internet and social media, the job has transformed quite a bit. But the heart of it is still to promote the assembly and its churches through every means possible. And so this is one of the ways in which the Church of God Mountain Assembly has made a worldwide presence in our age. Let's talk about the development of the Church of God Mountain Assembly's missions program. And most of you will remember that at the General Assembly this past year, we just celebrated our 50th anniversary of the missions program, and you're familiar with its history, and so we'll talk a little bit about the history of the CGMA into all the world. And we'll start by first of all, building the framework for a missions program. I mentioned Chester Miller's visit to the assembly in 1950. Chester Miller had been a missionary in Brazil for the Pentecostal Church of Christ. Chester spoke Portuguese like a native. He was a natural in that area and really accomplished a lot for his denomination in the nation of Brazil. Clayton Lawson, I mentioned, went on a mission trip with Miller to Brazil. And so in 1950, we got acquainted for the first time with foreign missions work through the Pentecostal Church of Christ. The following year, at the 45th General Assembly, on September the 4th, 1951, Clayton Lawson appointed the Church of God Mountain Assembly's first mission board and secured over $800 in pledges that week. The first mission board consisted of Ozza Vincent, Charles Lowry, Orville Roundtree, Luther Gibson, and J.H. Bryan. Now the following year, Otis Ellis replaced Lowry on the committee, and the committee was retained until 1958. Their job was to meet as often as deemed necessary to promote home and foreign mission work. Each church was asked to set the fourth Sunday's offering aside for the mission fund, and ministers were asked to send $1 a month to missions. And so that first year, 1951 to 52, a little over $1,000 was received by the local churches for missions. In 1952, one night of the General Assembly was set aside for the promotion and an offering of mission work. And that night, Ozzie Vincent and Luther Gibson tag team preached and preached that night as they received an offering for mission work. 1954, state mission directors were created. As a position that only lasted 1 year, they were replaced the following year with a general missions director who was the chairman of the missions board. The idea behind the state missions director was they would look for places to start local churches within their area, within their state. They had a standing policy. It was not a written policy anywhere in our bylaws or resolutions, but there was a standing policy. There was an idea that if a person wanted to start a church within a particular place, he could appeal to the state mission board and then later the general mission board. He could appeal to them about starting a church, and that the assembly would support him with 3 months rent on a building. And so you got 3 months. We'll rent a building for you for 3 months and see what comes of it. And so again, it wasn't anything that was etched in stone. It wasn't anything that was in our bylaws. But there was a kind of a standing, working arrangement that the assembly, out of that mission fund, would help anybody that wanted to start a church with the first 3 months rent in launching a church. And so in 1955, the state mission directors were dropped, and the general mission board was created, and a general missions director as the chairman of that board. Luther Gibson was the first general missions director to serve in that capacity. In 1957, the first genuine mission service was held during the General Assembly. Now, I mentioned that 5 years earlier they had designated one of the nights to be specifically for the offering to go toward missions. There doesn't appear to be a whole lot of other stuff taking place during the service that was mission related. But in 1957, the church service, the theme was revolving around missions. Luther Gibson preached that night about Jesus Christ, the sure cure of the world's ills. And then Clayton Lawson followed it up and spoke about the fire as a symbol of power, and that we needed to keep the fire burning. In 1966, James Earl Pruitt was elected by the General Council to serve in the office of Assistant General Overseer. Now, for the last 8 years, since 1958, the Assistant General Overseer had been a full-time position. We were paying somebody. I think that originally it was $90 a week, if you'll recall from a previous lecture. But we were paying somebody a full-time salary and to be the Assistant General Overseer. He was the Assistant Overseer, but he had no other official duties except to look after the general interest of all the churches as directed by the General Overseer. And so he was just kind of a figurehead and collecting a salary. Now, James Earl Pruitt found this lack of direction especially frustrating. Brother Pruitt was not one of those that just sit around and do nothing. He was not the kind of person he was not the kind of person to just have a title or to be a figurehead. He certainly was not interested in just collecting a salary without earning it. And so he went and talked to Brother Moses, who was the General Overseer at the time, expressing his frustration. He was so frustrated in having this position with nothing to do, with no job to do, with collecting a salary. He was so frustrated with it that he talked to Brother Moses about resigning. He's just going to resign as the Assistant General Overseer. Brother Moses encouraged him, no, you need to stay put. If you quit, you'll be branded a quitter. They'll call you a quitter from here on out. Just, don't rock the boat. Just stay put. And so while Brother Pruitt was contemplating his frustration, another opportunity presented itself. A man with a burden for missions. In the summer of 1965, at the Fullerton Avenue Church of God Mountain Assembly in Chicago, Illinois, Pastor James Walden made the acquaintance of Ronald Amos. Ronald and his wife Mavis had recently immigrated to the United States from England, and their background had been in the Nazarene Church. But they came to Fullerton Avenue Church where Pastor Walden was pastoring, and there they received the baptism of the Holy Ghost with the evidence of speaking in other tongues. Shortly after they started attending Fullerton Avenue, Ron Amos began to talk to Pastor Walden about the burden that he had for mission work. He felt interested, he felt called of God to do foreign mission work. And specifically, he just had a burden to go to Brazil, to take the gospel and to preach and launch a work in Brazil. And so Pastor Walden introduced Ron Amos to the 61st General Assembly during the Thursday morning business session on August the 10th, 1967. And so the opportunity to, having someone who was making himself available for foreign mission work, at the same time that our assistant general overseer was frustrated with nothing to do, seemed like the perfect opportunity to get the two of them together. And so that year at the General Assembly, and of course at that time resolutions could be presented to the General Assembly during the General Assembly. There were no requirement to send it ahead of time or anything like that. And so that year, the General Council amended its organizational bylaws, and the Assistant General Overseer became the chairman of the Mission Board, and he would now direct world evangelism. And so, again, the availability of one minister corresponded with the needs of another, and the Church of God Mountain Assembly launched its first foreign mission work as a result. With a gift of $500 from the National Youth Department, Ronald and Mavis Amos and their 4 children would move to Sao Paulo, Brazil in 1968, hoping to start a church. And so let's move forward, and we'll talk about the CGMA goes to Brazil. Now, I encourage you to read the 50-year history of the mission program that's included with your packet, and also encourage you to read a paper that I wrote as a graduate student in a class on world Christianity that talks about the mission program. You'll discover right away that the challenge that was in front of the Amoses was large. One of them was they were in a foreign country with 4 small children. And so adequately providing for 4 small children with limited medical abilities, with limited medical treatment available, medical facilities available with 4 small children, was a burden that was created right away. Obviously, there was the problem of finance. Now, at that first assembly, everybody wanted to, mission, yes, let's have missionaries. The Church of God Mountain Assembly is going to go worldwide. At that first assembly, the generosity and the appeal from the mission director to give toward it early on was really astounding that people were responding to giving. Challenge was sometimes people have false expectations. They don't realize how hard it is. A lot of people don't realize how hard it is to start a church at all. But to start a church in a foreign country is a challenge. And so by the next assembly, when there was no church yet in Brazil, people began to get discouraged and frustrated. And what are we giving toward? And so right away the Amoses were faced with the financial challenge of supporting a family of 6 in a foreign country with the lack of support coming in. Another challenge that the Amoses had was they didn't speak Portuguese. And so they went to Brazil to start a church, and right away were limited in their ability to communicate. They met the acquaintance of a local Brazilian minister by the name of Jose Amador de Silva. And so in 1968, they had relocated from Sao Paulo, which is the largest city in Brazil, to Tamborilla, and they had managed to find an old furniture warehouse, and were able to convert it and use it as a building to start with. And De Silva became the regular minister, the interpreter for Brother Ron, but also preaching on a regular basis there at the church in Brazil. There was a local radio broadcast, and so we finally got a church that was launched and underway. In 1970, the Amoses came back to the United States with the intention of going back to school to complete their education and then return back to South America with limited funding available and another opportunity presenting itself in the West Indies. Church of God Mountain Assembly focused its attention off of South America and into the Caribbean, and so let's talk about that next. Now, the church that was founded by the Amoses in 1968 was later on absorbed by the Pentecostal Church of Christ. I mentioned Chester Miller's work there for the IPCC, and so the work that the Amoses did there in the late 60s was absorbed by the IPCC and continues to remain until this day. Let's talk about, and I mentioned James Earl Pruitt, mission director from 1967 until 1970. Brother Pruitt had served in that capacity for 4 years as the assistant general overseer, 3 years as mission director. And in 1970, Claiborne Boyd Ellis Jr. was elected to the office of assistant general overseer and mission director, serving along with Brother Ira Moses. In the same year that Amos moved to Brazil, evangelist Walter Vaughn of Rockledge, Florida, preached several months in a crusade in the Bahamas. Now, Vaughn planned to spend the fall of 1968 in Jamaica, and Brother Pruitt was soliciting financial support for him from the CGMA churches to assist him, hoping that maybe we could launch something in the Bahamas, something in Jamaica, something in the Caribbean, in the West Indies. In 1970, Brother Pruitt had assumed the pastorate of the church of the Mulberry CGMA in Milford, Ohio, and so C.B. Ellis became the mission director. Now, through Brother Ellis's travels, he had met Jack Cates at a conference later that year, and Cates had presented to C.B. Ellis some contacts that he had, an open door, the possibility of an open door of work in Jamaica. Cates had been to Jamaica and knew some established indigenous churches that were there, some ministers there, specifically a man by the name of Elder Blair. And Elder Blair was in Kinloss, Jamaica, and so Brother Ellis came to know Brother Blair, and together they brought the Blairs and their churches in Kinloss and in the surrounding area. Brother Blair's sons, Ainsley and Neff and Harold and Delbert, they had been affiliated with the New Testament Church of God in Jamaica. And in 1971, came into the mission program of the Church of God Mountain Assembly. Now, again, there's a lot of information that's in the booklet, so I'm going to encourage you to read it. Glenn Rowe was elected to the office of mission director in 1972, the assistant overseer and mission director. Brother Ellis had become the general overseer in 72, replacing Ira Moses, and so Glenn Rowe was elected to assist him. Brother Rowe had made mission trips with Brother Ellis. He had been to Jamaica and was especially interested in the West Indies. And and continued developing and cultivating the relationships that he had made. One of the things that Brother Rowe also did is, as Brother Ellis had done before him, Brother Ellis had taken Brother Rowe and ministers like Jerome Walden and James Walden and Jasper Walden, Cecil Johnson, George Woods, and others on short-term mission trips. Brother Rowe continued that same project, introducing our men a week at a time to mission trips in Jamaica, getting them to catch the vision, and to solicit financial support, and so the work in Jamaica continued during that period of time. In the spring of 1973, Brother Rowe made a mission trip accompanied by Pastor Kenneth Massengill from Kendrick, Kentucky. And together they built a church at Moreland Hill in Jamaica and began construction on a new headquarters building at Cousins Cove. Brother Massengill had been to a mission rally that C.B. Ellis had conducted, had traveled with his wife Linda the previous January, and Brother Massengill had felt like God had called him to be a missionary when he was just a teenager. And on that first mission trip, he asked his wife Linda. He said, "Do you think that that we could you see yourself living in a little house down here by the sea in Port St. Lucie? And how would you like to live there?" And that burden for missions was in their heart. Just a few years later, they would. In 1974, Jerome Walden was elected to the office of Assistant General Overseer, serving along with Brother Ellis. Brother Ellis was the overseer, Brother Jerome Walden became the assistant overseer and relocated from Cleveland, Ohio to Jellicoe, Tennessee, and continued to develop the work in Jamaica. Brother Massengill, with that burden on his heart for Jamaica, desiring to be a full-time missionary, together with Brother Walden, we created the position of West Indies Island Overseer, and for 2 years sponsored the Massengill family in Jamaica. Brother Ken Massengill moved to Jamaica in 1974 with his 4 youngest children, attending school there in Jamaica, and continuing to develop the churches. The churches there. One of the things that Brother Massengill did as mission director was he took a lot of pictures and took a lot of pictures with slide film. And Brother Massengill created a slide presentation where he could go to churches and present a slide presentation of the mission work. And so during one of the slide presentations that Brother Massengill presented in Jellicoe, Tennessee, his slide presentations had come to the attention of Janie Hackler, young lady in the church in Jellicoe, and also at a slide presentation in Lake City, Tennessee, where Roger Powell was the pastor. Laura Taylor was also inspired and felt the call of God to go and to work in the mission field. Brother Massengill instructed Sister Taylor that her best chance of doing mission work in Jamaica would be as an educator, as a teacher, or in the medical profession. And so Sister Taylor went back to school and completed a degree in nursing to prepare herself for mission work in Jamaica. And Sister Janie Hackler, in the same way, was working a job for the state of Tennessee, working in social work, and she would prepare herself to go and teach English in the nation of Haiti. 1980, James L. Cox Jr. became the mission director, and at a mission board meeting at the General Assembly that week, Sister Taylor and Sister Hackler were officially commissioned to do missions work in Jamaica and in Haiti. And so Sister Taylor would move to Jamaica in January of 1981. She spent 3 years there on the mission field, doing missions work for the Church of God Mountain Assembly, preaching and serving as a nurse, doing medical missionary work there in Jamaica. And Sister Hackler went to the island of Haiti, and she would teach English. She had studied French in high school, but when she got to Haiti, she realized right away that the French that she studied in high school and the French that they spoke in Haiti were two different languages. But eventually she did do a pretty good job with Creole and was able to teach young children English in Haiti and assist in the mission work there. Let's talk about Asia and Africa. In the mid-1970s, Mrs. J.P. Strong in Vellore, India, had lost her husband very suddenly. Her only daughter and her family had come to the United States, and Sister Strong found herself a widow and in helpless state. In prayer, she sought God for a new purpose for her life. And God gave her the vision to start an orphanage in her home. Her daughter, now in Cleveland, Ohio, attended the Aspinwall Church of God Mountain Assembly, and through her contact with Pastor Walden, again, Pastor Walden, instrumental in getting us involved in mission work in another area of the world. Pastor Walden had contacted our mission director, Kenneth Massengill, and together they visited Vellore in January of 1979 and officially received the children's home, Sister Strong's children's home, into the Church of God Mountain Assembly. The Aspinwall Church has been supporting the mission program in India ever since then on a monthly basis. A church that was pastored by Arthur David was established nearby, and so that indigenous church in India was brought into the Church of God Mountain Assembly. Almost a decade later, Pastor Walden was visiting the orphanage there in Vellore, and he met a minister, Sam Daniel, who drove him to an eye doctor appointment, and so he began preaching for Brother Daniel on visits to India, and shortly thereafter, Sam Daniel joined the Church of God Mountain Assembly and became the national overseer of our work in India. And under his leadership, another 17 churches were established in India over the next 8 years. In 1996, that first children's home established by Sister Strong was finally closed when the last orphan that she was raising was raised and was out on her own. Sister Strong, at the age of 95, closed the children's home before the Lord called her home. Now the Church of God Mountain Assembly continues to operate 16 churches and multiple preaching stations, and Sam Daniel is also directing a girls' home there in Vellore. At the 78th General Assembly, 1984, La Follette, Tennessee pastor Jasper Walden was elected to the office of Assistant General Overseer and Missions Director. Brother Walden had a burden for Africa from the very beginning. He had a burden for Africa, the dark continent. And he began supporting interdenominational missions programs to help feed the hungry. Through his travel in Pentecostal conferences and conventions, and from publications of public relations materials, Brother Walden made several contacts with indigenous pastors in Africa. And during his first year as overseer, he was was able to report to the General Assembly that there was a wide open door that seemed to be presenting itself to the Church of God Mountain Assembly. And through Philip Tia in the nation of Liberia, and Job I. Kimson in Nigeria, Peter Kaboko in Zambia, Peter Sakwia in Malawi, and other places, the Church of God Mountain Assembly was able to incorporate 50 indigenous African churches to the mission program in just the next 3 years that Brother Walden was the mission director. And so for the first time, the Church of God Mountain Assembly got a foothold in Africa, which had been traditionally the center of world missions. And if you recall from our second session when we were talking about the global shift in Christianity in the world, and the global shift from the northern hemisphere to the southern hemisphere, and we talked about how the geographic center of Christianity in the world today is in the nation of Africa. And so thankfully we're able to be a part of that through Brother Walden's vision. In 1988, Kenneth Massengill was elected to the office of mission director, serving another term as mission director, continuing to expand on the works in the West Indies and India and Africa. And after 2 years in office, this time, and you can kind of tell from the terms that there's a tenure of office limitation in place now, a 4-year limitation, and I'll say more about that next week in the first session. But Brother Massengill, 2 years into his term, had the opportunity presented to him to pastor the church at Old Fort, North Carolina. Pastor Lloyd Camp, who had been there for many years, had passed away, and the church was without a pastor, and they'd called upon Brother Massengill. And so Brother Massengill came to the General Assembly in 1990, having been elected pastor of the Old Fort Church. And so the opportunity was open for a new missions director that particular week. There was some discussion early on. If you read the minutes of the 1990 Assembly, there's some discussion about the possibility of Brother Massengill serving in that capacity as pastor and at the same time serving as mission director. And the elder board chose not to give its sanction to the idea, and the general council voted not to allow the matter. And so that year, when the floor was open for nominations for mission director, there were 14 men nominated for the office of mission director. 10 of them declined. 9 of them declined, and one of them was not present, so he wasn't able to run. I'm sorry, I was right the first time. 14 men nominated, 11 declined, 1 wasn't present, and so there were 2 men were left in the running, and Johnny Douglas, J.H. Douglas, was elected to the office of mission director. Brother Douglas had just retired from pastoring full-time in Cincinnati, Ohio, relocated to Cincinnati, and so he assumed the office of assistant general overseer and mission director. And the next day, after maybe conferring with his wife or just thinking about the job at his age, came back and said, you know what, I shouldn't have done this, and he offered his resignation. Before the week was out, Bob Vance, the pastor of the church in Columbus, Ohio, was elected to the office of mission director at the General Assembly that year. Brother Vance, before the elders meeting took place in Florida, had not relocated to Jellicoe, had not moved to Jellicoe, had not resigned his church in Columbus. And again, the assembly had just voted not to allow Brother Massengill to pastor while serving as mission director. Brother Vance had not resigned his pastorate. He also had a relapse from polio, from his childhood polio, that limited him health-wise with his physical abilities. And so Brother Vance resigned as mission director in February 1991. And so from February until the next assembly, Brother Jasper Walden, as the general overseer, assumed the duties of the mission director until the assembly could meet in August. And And at that assembly in 1991, Reverend Cecil Johnson, the pastor of the church in Fondy, Kentucky, was elected to the office of Foreign Mission Director and Assistant General Overseer. In the 1990s, the Fort Myers, Florida church, pastored by Pastor Jesse Stevens, had made the acquaintance of Rafael Santiago. Brother Santiago had pastored in his native Puerto Rico for many years before relocating to South Florida and preaching and pastoring in Spanish-speaking congregations in Florida. Brother Santiago became a valuable resource for the Church of God Mountain Assembly as an interpreter and as a liaison for Hispanic works. In 1994, Brother Santiago started the first Spanish-speaking congregation in the United States for the Church of God Mountain Assembly, and today there are 5. Brother Santiago also, through his connections in Puerto Rico and in other places in the Hispanic world, brought the assembly into the acquaintance of David Badillo in Puerto Rico. Brother Badillo knew people in just about every country in the Caribbean and in Latin America, and was able to help the new mission director in 1996, Brother Lonnie Light, who was pastoring the church at Fondy and was elected Assistant General Overseer in 1996. He was able to connect Brother Light to indigenous churches that were looking for the umbrella of an organization and financial support that the assembly could give. And so really began to open up the door into Latin America. In 2000, the pastor of the church in Fondy, Kentucky, Reverend James Cox, was elected to another tenure. He'd been the mission director in 1980, and now 20 years later was being elected to another term. And during this time, God continued to open up doors in Spanish-speaking churches in the Philippines and in other places in Mexico and so that by the time Brother Cox left office in 2004, Church of God Mountain Assembly had works in Honduras, Dominican Republic, Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Venezuela, Mexico, and the Philippines. And so Latin America was ripe. The field was ripe and ready to harvest. In 2004, Jay Walden was elected to the office of Mission Director. Brother Jay had been serving as the National Youth Director for the previous 6 years. And so the Church of God Mountain Assembly continued to expand mission works in Latin America, in Paraguay, in Peru, in Ecuador. The Church of God Mountain Assembly also returned to Brazil in 2006. And so we came full circle nearly 40 years later, going back to Brazil. In 2007, David Goebel of the Monroe, Michigan Church of God Mountain Assembly went on a medical mission to Pakistan with John Geisler from the Sydney, Ohio Church. And there he met Paulus Masih, a pastor in Islamabad. And Brother Masih later joined the Church of God Mountain Assembly and brought with him 14 indigenous Pakistani churches into the Church of God Mountain Assembly, and also through a contact in Kabul, Afghanistan, another church in the Middle East was brought into the Church of God Mountain Assembly family. In 2011, under the threat of violence toward his family, Masih immigrated to the United States, now sponsored by the Mount Orab Church in Mount Orab, Ohio, and he continues to travel and raise support, awareness, and financial support for the 27 churches that we have in Pakistan. In 2010, Brother Light was elected again to another term of office as the Assistant General overseer and mission director, served in that capacity for 4 years. And at that time, the Broomfield, Ohio pastor, Pastor James Walden Jr. II, was elected to the office of Assistant General Overseer and Mission Director, and he continues to serve in that capacity at the present time. Anybody have any questions